the live cinema panel discussion. We did talk about some other titles for it. Experimental, experiential, I don't know. We just went for, does what it says on the tin. This is it. So my name's Christopher Thomas Allen. I am the founder and director of a studio called The Light Surgeons. We are a kind of multimedia studio. It's me as a director, producer, and then I collaborate with a lot of different people. I started doing this work back in the early 90s, not far from here. This is a venue called the Blue Note. It's probably now a nice cafe or something, but this area of London was really vibrant club scene, and after graduating in design and media, I came back to London, where I'm from, and started doing visuals, using mainly kind of analog slide and film stuff, and not really, weren't very digital. We were very into sort of second-hand equipment, film, sampling stuff from video back onto 16mm, and creating these kind of displays in nightclubs, where the material was very physical. We were very physically involved with film as a medium, and I think Sally's work really is represents that really interestingly today. And then I suppose I spent a long time doing sort of visuals for bands and music and clubs, and then got a little bit sick of that and started to explore kind of filmmaking as the sort of Firewire and desktop video thing came about, and started working with a festival called 1.0, where we just developed these sort of what we called live cinema performances, where we were sort of employing kind of VJing to kind of and narrative. So we did a lot of documentary filmmaking, kind of radio documentaries, where we would interview people and create these kind of narratives, and then we'd kind of create a kind of poetic, expressionistic sort of film that would run along with it. And this led to a number of different projects. This is a thing called based around the Fountainhead, called the Z-Axis, which was also part of 1.0 and full length. And then we were one of the first artists to be commissioned by MPAC in America, which is the Experimental Media Performing Arts Center in upstate New York. And they commissioned us to make a feature-length live cinema piece called True Fictions, which we then toured internationally and up in Manchester and around the UK. And then the latest project we've done of this sort is called Super Everything. It's a project based in Malaysia, funded by the British Council in Malaysia, and it received some Arts Council UK funding to be toured in the UK. We presented it here at Splice last year at Shapes. And we also work with Heritage Orchestra and various different musicians, composers. Tim, who's at the back, is performing today downstairs, amazing artist and composer. And so, yeah, these sort of shows, going to go back, yeah. So we also started playing around with audience interaction towards the end of this stuff. We've been playing with Twitter as a sort of form of mixing kind of comments from the audience. And I think this is an interesting area of like how social media might kind of blend into this kind of soft cinema kind of work. And we kind of put it in there because we were looking at freedom of speech in Malaysia, and the internet is one sort of space where people can have a say. So it had a sort of conceptual kind of reason to be in the piece. So this is just a little trailer I'm going to show you of this show that we toured.
Are essentially, we're all the same. We have the same instincts, we have the same impulses. We're just conditioned differently.
You will find the notion of memory and remembrance as being a very, very crucial one. And that memory, history, lineage, and ritual are very closely entwined.
Who am I? Where did you come from? What is your story?
The whole world is becoming one village, one small village.
It's about looking holistically at everything. What you eat, what you buy, where you go, how you live your life, your everyday ritual.
I think the pursuit for purpose is the meaning. I'm not sure we actually arrive at any sense of the truth.
beyond race, we have to go beyond religion, we have to go beyond creed.
There are far deeper fundamental questions that need to be answered. Questions about justice, questions about democracy, even questions about freedom.
Because I think if we don't know who we are, if we don't know where we've come from, how will we know where we're going?
This will be at Glastonbury Festival this year, if anyone's going to that, on Sunday, about 10 o'clock in a place called Shangri-La. And we've been continuing to tour that. This is some work that I haven't really put online yet, but I started experimenting with VR last year, and some dancers collaborating with some software developers called The Workers, who do some amazing stuff. So I'm kind of interested in this new technology. I've never really been driven specifically by technology, but I think it does open up really interesting ways in which new stuff can kind of be used in a sort of digital theatre environment. And I think that's an interesting area that overlaps with live cinema. So live cinema as a term, I kind of came to it after spending years of being called a kind of VJ, which I never really got on with. And then we were making these films and we were combining it with our kind of approach to sort of VJing and sampling and then filmmaking. And so it's all really just been a sort of convergence of lots of different creative processes for me. And I think cinema for me is a very broad thing. It doesn't have to be about narrative, live action. It can be documentary, it can be music videos, all these things are cinema. This was a quote that I could find, I think, originally that sort of coined it within the realms of what I think this festival explores, which is the sort of convergence of, sound and image. And, we tried to program like a range of different work that kind of represents that. I think my exploration of kind of Malaysia took me to the kind of tradition of wayang kulit, which is shadow puppet theatre, and for me that is probably the origins of film and cinema, because it predates any other form of Western film or media. It's a kind of it's about mythologies and stories and song, and these things last for like a day almost, and they're performed by and the kind of puppets are made, and it's a very kind of living, visceral, involved form of storytelling. And so for me to go back and study that and look at that was very influential, and I think still very simple. But then you've also got people like Paper Cinema, who are a UK group who do something similar to that, but using kind of cutouts and live storytelling, using puppets and live camera feeds. And this is one of my other favourite artists. She's from LA, Miwa Maracek. I was really hoping she'd perform this year, but she couldn't do it. But hopefully next year she'll come. But she does this amazing stuff where she sort of sandwiches herself between her animations, and her shadow she's her own kind of puppet, and it's very beautiful work. And I recommend you go and look at that. So other work, I'm just going to say briefly, because I think it's interesting to sort of see where people's references and what people like, and the panel hopefully will go on to say a bit about this too. But other people's work that I respect is Roger Akida's work. I think his superposition piece was one of the things I've seen in the last 5 years that really felt like kind of represented this sort of convergence of music, film, performance. And that led me to sort of try for many years sort of being frustrated. This festival's really come out of, I guess, a lot of people whose work fall between the cracks of music or film or new media. So myself and a group of other people tried to set up this live cinema foundation, or a kind of place where this sort of work can people can come together and discuss it and find funding and find ways to sort of keep it going. And we did an event at the Rose Lippman Library, which Sally was part of, and Toby came to speak. And I hadn't met Lisa at that point. unfortunately I had 2 kids and didn't have a lot of time to kind of follow it up. This festival was the sort of, because born out of my passion to support this sort of work, really. So I'm going to pass on to, and again, this is a sort of just a statement of the work that sits between the intersection of performance art, filmmaking, animation, design, computational art, and music. So that's quite a lot of things. But I think if anyone's interested and wants to get involved, we're kind of on Facebook for the moment, and then we'll probably start doing some smaller little events throughout the year, hopefully, as my children begin to sleep through the night. So yeah, that's a Vimeo group there as well with lots of videos. So if any of you on Vimeo, please add your stuff. It's an open group. So I'm going to hand over to Lisa Brook. Lisa came, cropped up, was pointed out to me through someone on Twitter, was like, oh, have you heard of this? I think it was someone in America who was like, Sam, you know Sam, who does the Buckminster Fuller film. He was like, have you met this woman? She's in England. It's livecinema.org. I was like, no, I haven't heard of it. So so I think I'm going to hand over to Lisa. Lisa can explain what she does, but I think it's really interesting. She's done some amazing research into this subject. So I'm pass over, and I should actually introduce Toby Spark, and this is at the end, Sally Golding.
Thanks for inviting me down, Chris. I'm based in Huddersfield, so I've travelled down and back today. So I'm the director of Live Cinema UK, and I wasn't aware of the Live Cinema Foundation, which could have easily been the name of our company. Yeah, so but I think it's awesome that we've found each other, and we're all ultimately working towards the creation of amazing live performances around screened content. So roughly, just as like a potted history of what I do, Live Cinema UK, there's about 5 of us in the company now. We're growing massively, and it's brilliant, but we're so fucking busy. We commission and produce projects which push film exhibition forward and keep it exciting. Cinema remains unchanged for the first 100 years. It was ultimately a group of people in a dark room with a screen sat watching. And before I set up Live Cinema, we've been running about 4 years now. I was exclusively working at film festivals. And the best-selling events, the ones that got the best reviews, and the ones that we found the easiest to market and the most exciting for me as an audience member were always the screenings that had live performance attached to them. So the one event that made me think this is what I want to do with my life was producing From the Sea to the Land Beyond with British Sea Power, which world premiered at Sheffield Doc Fest in 2012. And we also work. Generally, we don't work in London. We commission things that do come to London, but we have a very national and international perspective on what other cinemas are doing, and other film festivals and other arts festivals. We're right in the middle of, if you think of one side of funding being the Arts Council and the other being the British Film Institute, we pull our resources from both those areas. So we have conflicting at times remits from both those organisations. The BFI want us to produce work that is about film in the traditional cinema sense, but brings in arts audiences. The Arts Council want us to produce work that's arts audiences, but brings in film audiences. So this is a really interesting area of research and progress for us. We produced the Live Cinema Report and the Live Cinema Conference last year. We've not publicly announced it yet, but we have funding to return the Live Cinema Conference next year, which will be announced very shortly, and it's going to be awesome. I'll try and talk more about that later. We are currently working on 2 huge projects. One of them is Sheffield Doc Fest, which is my spiritual home. We're producing all the live events for Sheffield Doc Fest this year, which is amazing, including the opening night, which is an archive compilation film by Daisy Asquith called Queer Armour, with a live performance by John Grant. That's on the 9th of June. Also on the 9th of June, I don't know how I can't be in 2 places at once, we have the London premiere of The Unfilmables, and I've got a couple of slides, and should we do the trailer? If we could look at the trailer. So The Unfilmables comes from a concept... Yeah, yeah. So this is not a very engaging still, but the Unfilmables comes from the concept that we've been working on for about 18 months of what happens if you asked musicians to make a film that doesn't exist. Yeah. So we spent about 18 months trying to find artists that we thought would be the best fit for this project. We had a short list of about 30, and eventually we settled with Wrangler, which is the new project from Stephen Mallender of Cabaret Voltaire, and Mika Levy, the Oscar-nominated, BAFTA-nominated composer of Under the Skin and most recently Jackie. We worked with them on selecting unmade film concepts, and Wrangler chose a film called The Tourist, which has never been made. It was going to be made in the 70s. The script was completed. Francis Ford Coppola was going to exec produce it, and then it never, ever got made. So they have actually imagined what they would create as this film, and it is truly live cinema in whatever sense of the word, because there is a live AV mix of it as well. I've got the trailer for it, if we could just watch that. This does have sound.
Do you know the Eti code? It looks like a bombed-out war zone. A grimy hall. The doorbell creaks open. A filthy old woman. She sticks her head out.
What do you want here?
So I wasn't sure whether I wanted to show that trailer because it really doesn't do justice to what the experience is. Most of the film is shown in triptych, and it is being live mixed as well with extra visuals by Dan Conway and, of course, live performance by Wrangler. So The Unfilmables is in two parts. This is part 2. Part 1 is Mika Levy's film, which she has made with her sister, Francesca Levy, whose background is in opera. Which I think is brilliant because it's bringing together all these different art forms. And she has remade an Armenian film called The Colour of Pomegranates, but she set it in Blackpool and called it The Colour of Chips. And it is just as batshit as you can imagine it is. And Mika performs a live score to that as well. So that's what we're currently working on. I've got loads of other things I could say, but I'm aware that we're quite limited for time, so I will let someone else talk for a little bit.
Hello. So yeah, my name's Toby, and I've just got 5 slides, and so this is the first one. So this is a piece that I made. It's a live cinema piece, and we've been talking about live cinema. And so in terms of cinema, like one of the resonances that word has for me is the idea of characters. And so this is a 45-minute kind of live cinema performance. It's improvised. It's from a laptop, da-da-da-da-da. But it is very much kind of inspired by a filmy film. And it has characters. So this is a character card for one of the characters. So it doesn't exactly have a story, but it has characters and scenario. And so I kind of present a series of scenarios and a series of characters. And I may do this kind of one way, I may do it backwards, I may do it inside out, depending on how I feel at the time. And it is very much up to you, the audience, to kind of interpret the story to make a story out of what I'm presenting to you. But in terms of kind of showing you a portfolio, this really was conceived as quite a kind of cinema-y film. So when I perform it, there is, as in film, there is a soundtrack, there is sound design on all the video clips that I'm doing, and it's all kind of composited together to really be, quite an integrated audiovisual whole, very much kind of in the tradition of how a film is made, how a Hollywood film, whatever, is put together. Although being a live thing, it is much more impressionistic and there's much more kind of motion graphic-y. So this is Urban Escape. One thing I made, one thing, I consider live cinema. And the next thing is I'm also part of Defuse, who, a bit like the Light Surgeons, we occasionally get to go around the world performing nice kind of expanded cinema, live cinema, sonic cinema. You know, we could argue about the definitions, but essentially we get up on stage, we create an expanded kind of screening environment. We sit ourselves in the middle of it, and we improvise an audiovisual performance from our laptops. It is much, our work as Defuse is a bit more kind of, the production process, the audio and the visual are inspired from each other, but it is much more kind of a musician creating a composition and us creating visuals kind of as two parallel things responding, as opposed to kind of the real kind of tight synthesis of maybe that earlier piece I showed or Chris's work. So these two things I would consider kind of traditional live cinema. I mean, I don't know whether we want to use the word traditional, but a kind of a very straightforward kind of understanding of it. And I like this work. I think it's fun, and I think it's engaging, and I want to see more of it. But we're having a panel talk, so let's go a bit beyond it. So what is the next slide? Right, okay, so this is some commercial work I did, and it was a bit bonkers going around the world being part of motor shows. But this was the year when Time magazine had you as the person of the year. It was the year when user-generated content was really kind of the hot thing. And what at motor shows, they are essentially a bit of pretty architecture around a TV advert. They've kind of descended into who has the biggest TV screen as their stand. And so it kind of becomes just a bombardment of who can make the prettier advert, which is a kind of diminishing returns. And so this really amazing London-based creative company called Imagination thought, well, actually, you know, we can do something better here. We can make this, rather than trying to show off the cars, we can kind of engage with the people who want to buy our cars. The people who are coming to our stand are interested in us, and we should be able to harness that and kind of reflect that back to them. And they also realized by having live performers there in the middle of that audience, they actually had a kind of a real touch point of interaction for the audience to engage with. And so we actually, every 15 minutes throughout the day, we basically made little kind of music videos out of all of this kind of interview footage that we were shooting with people and their text messages and all that. And it was wildly expensive, and everybody thought it was going to be the next best thing in the world. You know, the world was going to get taken over with it, but then the recession happened, so oh well. But I think this is really interesting. I mean, I think you as a live performer have the opportunity to really engage with an audience, and that's one thing that we can really develop and can be interesting about live cinema. So, next slide. Yeah, this is a robot doing stand-up comedy. I was part of this project. I've been doing a PhD at university, and this is part of my PhD. So we taught a robot a bit of stagecraft. So the nice thing about the robot is that he can deliver exactly the same jokes every time. So the jokes are constant, but you can manipulate the delivery. So you program the interactivity of the robot itself, and because you program it, you know exactly what is going on, well, how it is relating to its sensory inputs of the audience and what it's giving back to them. And I can tell you lots of statistics about how people react differently when robots are staring them in the eye, and so on and so forth. But I just think it's it's just an interesting thought experiment of, you know, like what is actually live here? Because, you know, the content is essentially burnt down, pre-produced already, but the actual delivery of it is there, spontaneous, kind of reflecting the actual empirical audience who is there in front of them, you know. People, you know, the robot's eyes and you, specifically your eyes, you know, when that gaze happens, crazy things happen in people's heads. And that's how, you know, live experiences are formed, right? It's those moments. Next slide. And so finally, this was, again, like the Ford VJ thing, a kind of a noble project that I wish had gone further than it did, but maybe it was a bit before its time. But so the idea was, I had spent all this time making that first live cinema film, and I basically spent a year in a dark room making all this footage. And I thought, you know, I just can't be bothered to spend a year in a dark room making all this footage again. but I really enjoy the live event and the kind of the doing it and the being there with people. So maybe we can make something out of that. You know, can I come into this room with nothing and make a story out of that? And so we kind of assembled like a band, like an audio-visual band. So instead of drums and a guitar, we had like poets and illustrators and kind of Foley sound and whatever. And so we kind of had a band. I made a load of tools so that we could kind of produce stuff together. And it was all built around asking the audience an opening question, and then they responded through text messaging and Twitter and whatever. And so the idea was just from this one kind of seed question, a whole story could develop. And this is us doing it as, you know, in a big outdoor courtyard where you can't really tell what the story is going on, but it just, yeah, it kind of turned into this big kind of multimedia spectacular. And again, like, I don't really think we kind of hit what the potential of that idea is, but I think, you know, I think there is a lot of potential in kind of that idea of arriving with nothing and as a collective, as a community, evolving something out of the ether. And I think that's it from me.
Since about 2004, I'm an artist curator, so I really began my practice looking into, can you hear me actually? Sorry. Began my practice looking into expanded cinema in tandem with making and curating. I'm also an archivist, and I'm really interested in media archaeology, the histories of both artist-led and consumer technologies. I tend to think that no media is new because all media was once new. So I don't really come from a sort of, you know, technocratic position where I think I have to use the latest technology. I tend to come from more of a craft position. I like to use materials which are very tangible and tactile, and I like to turn those tactile elements of image and projection also into other forms such as sound. But I will take you through a few of my previous works, and I'll also explain a little about the kind of thoughts I was having when I was beginning to curate shows under the organisation Other Film in Australia and Unconscious Archives here in London. Oops. Just a little bit more context. I'm quite interested in liveness, for lack of a better phrase. I'm interested in reorganizing the performance and projection space. You're probably familiar with some histories in expanded cinema. They're really about the reorganization of the industrial film system. So expanded cinema is really a more historical term, coming from a place particularly key around the 1960s, particularly in London, such as with the London Filmmakers Co-op, or other histories in New York and San Francisco. But for myself, I'm very interested in the body and the performer, reorganizing these systems of feedback and light. My work, I will show you some actual pictures next, not just really crappy text. But I kind of use a few different motivations within my work. So I have worked a lot in a dark room. I spent most of my life in a dark space. It can be very traumatizing in there, actually. It's nice to come out sometimes. But I like to use the optical soundtrack area of the 16mm film projector. So printing images into that area to create sound. And I do tend to think of it as an area for perhaps radio play or extended ideas, even in psychology, perhaps. I like to amplify the devices. I like to generate sound out of the elements of projection and vision that I can work with. I'm very drawn to finding a very tactile space between sound and vision. And then I come to audiovisual compositions, where I like to think about the light as a composition as much as we would usually with sound. I have done some work in the past, projecting onto myself. I like the kind of element of surprise, so perhaps I'll start the 16mm film projectors up, and then I'll walk within the performance space so the projections catch upon my body. The type of sound that is playing when I'm doing a performance like this, such as this Face of Another performance, is a kind of... oh, I'm sorry. Clearly can't work a microphone. Hello. The type of sound that I like to use is also coming from a bit of a media archaeology kind of feel. I like to work with sampling off vinyl and then reworking it onto film and cut up. So the sound is very sort of ghostly, aggressive. I've done some other works as well, working with the element of surprise and projection, starting the projectors up, facing the audience, then walking into the space to catch those images upon perhaps a screen. Again, looking into media archaeology, thinking about how these systems such as color in film were originally created, and then hacking them. Working with an artist sitting right behind you over there, Matt Spenlove, Mr. Spatial. We'll be doing a performance tomorrow, but Matt and I have been working, combining projection, analog light sources such as torches and strobe lights with coding, which is Matt's working on. And here is some of the optical sound you can see articulated on the side there. So my performances tend to be very much about finding a kind of feeling of maybe hallucinogenic space, or that synthesis of sound and light. But I like to think that the outcome of this is very encompassing. I think there's a feeling of liveness. The sound and light really fill the space, and the performances are quite chaotic and have an element of surprise. So also working in installation, the original piece where I was projecting onto myself, I had a lot of feedback from people wanting to know how that was created, or what motivated me to do it, or how it's done. So I also created a number of installations which the audience members themselves could become involved in the projection space in terms of reflection. Again, they might find themselves merged with the image, or perhaps just find themselves considering themselves and their own presence, should the lighting turn on and off to merge or not merge the projection. And a recent one just last year at the South London Gallery, removing any projection and just thinking about light in the space and the presence of the audience, really sort of trying to figure out a way where perhaps there was a blurring of audience performer, so the audience member perhaps forming a part of the work with the presence of their reflection and programmed lighting. I nicked these off Twitter. It was quite nice to find that people were exploring themselves within the projection and sonic space. This was a composition of light and sound, which was programmed generatively to come on and off in a number of different combinations as a AV composition. Other film, I think I began to look into these histories. I also found that we had a lot of documentation of elderly men in the projection space. So I think it's taken me many years to come to be able to find a space for myself as a female performer, and also help other women gain a little bit more of a platform, I think, for their work. But these histories were dominated only, if not in the actual creation, but more through the proliferation or the marketing or the promotion and the lasting resonance of this work. But these artists are particularly interesting, some Australians. Arthur and Corinne Cantrell. I think Corinne's sort of represented by this mono boob pink screen on the left there, but Arthur there is doing some live painting over the projection, and Dirk de Bruin on the right is interfering in his own projections and also shouting and speaking concrete poetry over his projections. So we thought more about the feeling of the space and the sense of perception than we did necessarily. We began with experimental film histories, but we became to think about how the audience was integrated in these spaces. Again, I think I could be digging my own grave here at a festival like this by positioning myself as some kind of technophobe, but that's not the case at all. I'm just really interested in the ways that different media, both old and new, can be used to create a sense of space and a sense of participation. And I guess as an archivist and someone interested in media archaeology, I'm quite critical of the sort of, I guess, the politics of manufacture in terms of equipment and software.
Cool.
So just to finish up.
Yeah, that's great.
And the series that I currently run in London and afield, Unconscious Archives. So I'm still interested in diversifying my history and background in experimental film and expanded cinema, and I'm particularly interested in positioning work within other contexts, so sonic sound art practices, hybrid art, visual art, and I also do some writing and thinking on the subject as well, such as recently for an article for the San Francisco Cinematheque. So just thinking about the histories, but trying to bring it back to the contemporary. I'm going to skip this one. And I just want to come back to, I'm quite interested in the use of the terminology. I think it's a good point for people to talk about live cinema, expanded cinema. This is a still from Steve Poulter, director of San Francisco Cinematheque, trying to think through perhaps almost the ridiculous nature of trying to coin and dominate these terminologies. I quite like this diagram. And again, I just want to finish up by looking at maybe some more histories. The recent documentary by the late, great Tony Conrad, about the late, great Tony Conrad. I really like Tony Conrad's sense of physicality and intuition that he brought to his work. So, bowed film and sukiyaki, cooking and throwing film at the screen. So these are some of the more perhaps diverse practices in live cinema that I'm quite interested in. Maybe a really intuitive physical response to technology in even an absurdist way. And here's a recent slide by a Spanish contemporary artist, Esperanza Collado, interfering in her projection space. That's my intro, so I can pass it back over.
That's fascinating. I mean, there was a lot of text there, so if anyone wants to read any of that stuff, it's going to get put online, so don't panic. You can go and check the YouTube video and take all that in. But that's fascinating. So I think it is a diverse group of people we have. So we had some questions. Can we switch back to the other projector, the other thingy? As Sally said, she's performing tomorrow afternoon, aren't you? With Matt, who's sitting at the back. I really recommend going along to check that out. Got the other. Yeah, there we go. One. Okay, and it will look a bit like that, right? That's
Actually, no, not at all. No.
Oh, okay. Screw that. Sorry.
That was a previous iteration.
So we have some questions. There was a bit of an email thread. We had some different thoughts. So I think what's interesting, maybe, and this is where we like input from everyone, is what contemporary audiences what are contemporary audiences enjoying that might be called live cinema. So this is something I think Toby put in one of his emails. I mean, I personally have. I feel a little bit, as Sally was saying, at the end of the day, we could kind of debate the term, but I don't really know how really kind of important that is. But I think if anyone's got anything to add to maybe what we've said, because we've gone from a car show to someone throwing burnt film at a screen, I'd say that's pretty kind of across the board. But if there's anything else that maybe other people think that's missing that could be brought into this sort of discussion, please let us know. Do you want to?
Yeah. So this question was the anti. Let's define what it is, and let's just see if people, see if anybody who is here has enjoyed something, and then we can kind of reverse engineer what the term might be from that. But so what I enjoy going to the cinema. I enjoy going out to music gigs. I enjoy going out to many kind of conventional things that are quite well served, in our contemporary culture. But what I have enjoyed I'm basically thinking about a Chris show. Or Chris
Not just me.
Yeah, I know. And I remember, so I went to see this thing. It's very much a one-off. You only see one of these things every few years because they're so hard to make and so on and so forth. And I just remember coming out going, well, actually, that was like a kind of a concept album. Like, it's a bit of a derided term now, but there was this time when bands who got a bit bored with just a conventional bunch of songs, they tried to kind of create something bigger than that. And so it was still a bunch of songs, but there was a kind of a concept and there was a kind of a narrative
like prod rock.
Well, and rock
Spinal
opera
Tap,
and God, whatever.
You see what I'm saying?
But I really remember coming out and thinking, that was great. Like, I want to see more of that. I want to see something that is a bit like a music gig. It's a bit like, here are a collection of songs. Here is a sequence of, discrete things. It doesn't all blur into each other. Here's an interesting thing, and now here's an interesting thing, and now here's an interesting thing. But when it is audio-visual, when you have the kind of the filmic element, it really gives you license to kind of to go beyond just what you can sing about, or what might make sense if you sing about it. You can, well, we don't need to get into it too much, but you can do so much more if you have film as well. And so I enjoyed this kind of audio-visual concept album thing that I went to see, and I would like to see more of that. I don't understand why there isn't more of that. It makes sense to me as a thing that there should be. It seems like...
Do you think that's missing? Do you see 1024 yesterday?
I did.
Did you think that fell into that category?
Um,
Did anyone else? Did anyone else here see 1024 performance yesterday? And did anyone want to say anything about that? Like, because it'd be really nice to hear what people think. And you could just shout out or holler. I mean, we're talking through mics because we're recording this, so it's obviously easier to hear what people say. So if you want to say something, just stick your hand up. But I thought I saw it, and I don't know. It was good. I journeyed through someone's vagina at one point, which was kind of unexpected.
They are French, you know.
They are French, but I wasn't quite sure about it. I turned to a woman who's sitting next to me, and she sort of went like that, and that's kind of a bit like two French guys on stage, kind of, you know, making the audience fly through.
It was, I mean,
it's kind of bizarre moment. But as a show, it was interesting. I thought they were kind of playing with sort of poetry. They were playing with a lot of new technology. They were playing with kind of LiDAR scanned. And if anyone didn't see it, it was worth watching. Hopefully, we'll put the stream up of it. But that was a really interesting kind of theatrical kind of. I think, you know, for me, I think what's interesting is the technology and the things these guys are playing with. Also goes back to some of the stuff Sally was talking about. You know, there's a long history of people messing with film. And Lisa started by saying film hasn't changed in 100 years. I think film has. I think film cinema wasn't that. Cinema was people playing the organ to silent movies. You know, it was always live. So cinema's always been live. And if I go back even further, you go to Wine Coulet, where cinema probably originates from the concept of sitting in a dark room and having a story told to you in the shadows that I'm making now with my hand. You know, that goes back. That's like, I've got two little kids, and you know, you get a torch out and you just get one of their little figures and you start putting on the wall, and you know, their brains, you know, human minds are kind of wired for that kind of the magic of the shadow and the story, and we're always looking for patterns to sort of see those things. So I think for me, all this stuff is very root. It's not about future tech. It's actually going back to something quite primal in our human ability to own our stories, to be actively using and be part of them, rather than them being given to us by Hollywood and going into a cinema and popping popcorn and eating lots of sugar and taking on these like ridiculously overwrought CGI kind of epics that we're kind of, you know, bottle fed and then sold to with kind of consumable kind of spin-offs and what have you. It's about people owning the media and actually using the media to tell the stories that they want to tell and to comment on what's actually going on now. You know, when you've got politics and you've got all these things that aren't getting on the screen, you know, that for me is where live cinema is an amazingly interesting area, because it's a bit like cabaret. It's like, you know, what was happening in Berlin before the war. You know, it's people being able to be satirical, be able to comment, and to be able to explore the mediums to express things that aren't getting told or fed to them through other kind of platforms. Anyway, let me pass over because I was just ranting.
No, and I did say largely unchanged from the audience point of view. Yeah, I mean, I could spend a whole hour just discussing this question. Yeah, a day, because this is what film festivals and cinemas come to Live Cinema UK to get us to do, is to bring them audiences. They say to us, what projects have you got that we can programme? And we select from our knowledge of what's on at the moment and what people are producing, things that we can put to these festivals so that they can give them money to come and have these amazing new live cinema experiences. And there isn't really a formalised structure for how that stuff gets into festivals, and especially film festivals. And the knowledge outside of London of projects that are in festivals like Splice Festival is very low. Like, we're missing out. I have a plan. I have money and a plan, and it's part of the next round, the next generation of what Live Cinema UK is going to become. We're going to develop a live cinema talent pool where we match you up with producers and festivals from various different backgrounds, because there's so little knowledge. And I know audiences will love everything that's being shown here and performed here, that and they don't know they'll love it, but they will, because they love watching film and they love being involved in a performance. They love having that feeling of aura that comes with having a live performance around a film screening. So we can transfer these audiences across the arts and film sectors. And you were saying about the narratives, the key important narratives, and that aren't on the big screen. We're also managing to get people that come to, you know, secret cinema experiences that are in that, which in the broader sense of live cinema, we do include that in the definition that we use, because it is performative as well as having a screen there. So this sort of very populist audience, for want of a better word, we are starting to see them become more exploratory with coming to events more like this, that when we, so for example, I know that we're short of time and I could talk forever about this. I'll just talk about Sheffield Dockfest really briefly, because we've got a event that is basically a haunted house experience with a screening of a new film about haunted house experiences. So that's quite a populist event. It's like it's a haunted house. Everyone loves being scared. Well, most people love being scared. So we're producing that, but then the audience that are coming to that are also really wanting to book for this project called Doom Room, which is by a Danish theatre company. And it's an existential immersive theatre piece that also involves virtual reality. It's everything. It's all these different things, and it's quite hard to define and without having done it. But because it's got that narrative about death and it's immersive, the audiences that are booking for this horror experience are seeing those words immersive and death, and they're coming to this quite high concept art and VR piece. So we are seeing a crossover, and what we want to do is make sure that we're getting amazing projects to wider audiences, and that's no one's doing that at the moment, but that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would think about this question more so. I mean, as a performer, I'm really in direct contact with the audience a lot. So perhaps during the setup of a show and after performing, people will come and speak to me directly, and it's just really interesting. I think I can also build my sense of what live film performance and expanded cinema and its iterations can be by getting this sense of feedback from the audience. People are very interested in the ways that technology can be used, very tactile. They feel very involved and in the moment of a performance, which is kind of very encompassing in the space in terms of how the sound and light are presented. And again, that element of sort of those presentations being quite surprising and quite experimental, what will happen next. So I think it's quite different in the sense that I have a lot of direct feedback from the audience, and I'm quite interested in trying to think through what those experiences for the audiences are. Like, how would they be experiencing this? And that's very much in my mind when I'm performing. I'm very much thinking about the audience and the experience and the feeling of the space and the time and the liveness. So
should we move on to the next, so we can is anyone from the audience want to add anything to that they've been to or seen, or that feel we're kind of, let's move forward because there's some other ones. So how has the experience of audiovisual been liberated through performance and liveness? So kind of, I guess this gets again to the root of that kind of idea of like, how do we, you know, so you can go and see some stuff where, you know, essentially, particularly electronic music artists will just be playing like a file off a computer and standing in front of a computer and facing an audience, and it's not very live, you know, but they're on stage, and so they're the focal point in a room, you know, maybe they're a DJ or an act on stage, and so, you know, there's a sort of question about liveness. Is liveness in the minds of the audience and in a sort of projection onto them of like, oh, this thing is happening, or does that really matter? You know, what's the, you know, what's important, and where is it sort of liberated through it being performed live? Does anyone have an answer to that one? What do you think, Toby? Toby?
I was trying not to go first on this question. I mean, the short answer is I've just written a thesis on this, but let's not.
That's
go
the
there.
short answer.
I once saw a Mike Figgis live performance. He produced a film,
Time Code.
Time Code, and so it's it's 4 continuous shots, all you know. The 4 cameras start at the same time. The cameras follow different characters, and so they're presented in the 4 quarters of the screen. And I've watched this just, you know, at home on a TV, but I've also seen it in the cinema with Mike Figgis there live. And and so what happened is you're just watching this film, and then all of a sudden it went, and it wound down to pause, and then it, good old analog style tape deck, it kind of went, and it played backwards for a bit, and then we rewatched, like the past 5 minutes, and what Mike Figgis had done is he then changed the sound mix so that the one of the different quarters of the screen, the sound for that was more prominent. And it was an amazing experience where you realize you're just watching exactly the same thing that you've watched before, but you are having a completely different relationship with what you're seeing and hearing. And the fact that somehow, even though you couldn't necessarily see Mike Figgis, like he was he was in a box in the audience somewhere, but it wasn't that he was like a scenographic element on stage. But just when that film stopped, you just knew that the author of that film was kind of doing an authorial thing, with you in that room. And it was really like way more deeply affecting than I can kind of articulate now. And so that is, one way that audiovisual work has been kind of liberated through performance and what we might call liveness. I mean, to answer your question, where does liveness reside and whatever, well, I came into this world through standing behind a laptop on stage, and at some point I realized that the audience would have a better show, maybe, if I just did a studio take that was really good and then just hit play. And if I bobbed my head to my inbox on my laptop screen, then when I came off stage, I would be really happy because I would have just read some nice emails and I wouldn't be stressed. Instead, I come off stage effing and blinding, that this didn't work, that didn't work, I missed that cue, I hate this software, it's so annoying that the buttons are so small, and why am I concentrating on these pixels when, I should be somehow doing something far more expressive. And so that really kind of questioned to me, whether the liveness of me being a performer, I kind of came to the conclusion that really was just an alternative production process, and what was interesting is the experience, the interaction and the experience that comes from the audience, because they are what are it's a different mix of people every time interacting in all sorts of different ways. And so for me, the future that I would like to be doing is working out ways to really instead of playing with the files I have on my computer, I want to play with the audience. I mean, that's what I think is, trying to make a live performance event as far apart from the DVD at home. Yeah, that's my rant.
I think maybe along those, I actually thought you were going to come into this world through a virtual vagina, actually. But anyway, I think in terms of playing with those audience expectations, though, I think that's what's exciting about being, the physicality of the space. I think we use our senses to connect with the vibrancy of a live performance and performers being present. So when I perform, for example, I like to be highly present. I like to kind of work the machinery a lot. And I think people have a reaction to that. And people are always like, what is this and how does it work? And I think people have a sense, you're getting under the skin, aren't you, to think about the machinery and technology. So that's interesting too. We're not separated by the you and us of manufacture.
I'll be really quick. Sorry, we're running over. Also, I have to get back to Huddersfield. I think, without getting into a massive conversation about future tech, because there is this sense of, virtual reality and digital integration with audiences, that it's a fad and it's being used for the sake of it. But I think there is something to be said for placing the audience in collaboration with the artist. For one example is the Creative Media Scotland screenings that they did at Edinburgh Digital Festival last year, which is a new festival as part of the Fringe, where the audience's mobile phones were used to create the soundtrack to 12 Monkeys. Not 12 Monkeys, the thing that 12 Monkeys... La Jetée that 12 Monkeys was based on. So there is interesting things that can be done with it, but there's so many different options to the audience liberation now that I don't think any one of them is developed well enough for the audience to be truly digitally integrated with a piece of live cinema. But I'd like to see something happen that is... Because whenever I go to these things, they always break. Like when someone's like, oh yeah, the audience can control everything with the mobile phone and the artist responds to it. It very rarely works. So if anyone's found a project that does that and works, let me know, because there's loads of funding for tech integration at the moment. So yeah.
Can I just quickly? So just on that, I mean that's just such the classic example. So we all have mobile phones, so we can now interact with the screen and everything. So there is all at the moment there is such a potential to really have these kind of interactive, integrated kind of environments, but if you take out your mobile phone and you look at the screen and you are now thinking about what's on that screen, you have taken yourself out of the live event, You are no longer connected to the people around you, and you're now in a bubble down here, completely separate. If you are in a VR experience, I have yet no VR experiences are designed to kind of take that amongst the audience kind of sensation. I mean, they're all these kind of individualized experiences. So, I think the potential is there, but just when people say interaction, I really don't think we've really moved beyond it's interactive because I made a touchscreen kiosk in the corner. We're still...
Come up here later for EBN's interactive installation then. Sorry, plug that. I think it's all true. I mean, the other thing I'd maybe add to that, and maybe this is... So there might be some people who's a practitioner, who's making stuff, who's interested in kind of getting involved in this and starting out. Because I think it's also about how do you make money and get paid and sustain yourself as an artist. Because I think that is a question that's also liberation is in freedom for me, and freedom for me has been having the time to create stuff and present it. And part of the presence and performing something, it allows it to be for me to be paid to do that. If I just made really amazing films and just put them on Vimeo for nothing and just gave all my ideas away, and I wouldn't, I might be a great artist but it's just, so there's this proliferation of content through the internet, and I think bringing it back to performance gives people a means to create a way of subsistence, which I think is interesting. And I think musicians have experienced the same thing. We've had this huge boom in music where it got kind of put on a record and sold and created the Beatles and all this stuff, and huge gloated kind of corporate kind of music industries that were born. And then, as the digital revolution came along, things suddenly went back to being about performance and being live and being there, And again, that goes back to what I was saying about coming back to something that's very human, about presence and people sharing stuff and having some direct relationship with the medium and the work. And I think that will come with VR. I agree. VR for me still feels quite an individualistic. I can't get past the sort of ostrich kind of element of it, the kind of putting the technology on your head and kind of cutting yourself off from the world. But it is pretty amazing, some of the work that's being made. I should mention Mema Atkin's going to be talking very shortly, and he's doing some amazing work with VR, which I hope he'll talk about. Should we move on to one last question? How are we doing for time? Has anyone got a candle on time? So we got, what time are you down as, Memo? You're not sure? Okay, we'll go with it. We'll keep going. Okay, what possibilities does live cinema hold for the creation of new work? I think some of this we've covered a bit, but I think for me, this is a sort of interesting kind of conversation to have at a festival like this, where you've got lots of different people coming from different areas. We've got, new emerging technology. We've got kind of rediscovery of old technology. I mean, for me, when I first started doing visuals, it was actually about the liberation of the technology that was being sold secondhand. So my brother was into Rare Groove Records and would go to car boot sales, and I'd sort of wander around bored with him thinking, well, I'm not going to be a DJ. So I just started buying slide projectors because everyone was flogging their old analog stuff. So, I mean, I think that's an interesting thing to consider now, is what are people chucking away, getting rid of, what's on the skip, what's being thrown out, what's being discarded, because that is that's where that technology kind of gets thrown out. That's where it's sort of free to become liberated, and the kind of the art forms can arise out of that. I'm also really excited by open source software and what's happening with that, and how that kind of model of not being kind of proprietary with your ideas and sharing them and being part of a community is amazing. I've been working with some great open frameworks people in the last sort of 5 years, and I think that's an incredible area. And then also people getting under the kind of technology. We all carry these sort of sealed objects around with us that we can't get into now. Well, if you're on Apple anyway. And you know, it's nice to sort of understand the electronics, because I haven't got a fucking clue about how any of this shit works. It's probably made in 5 or 6 different countries, you know. So people that are kind of getting on into electronics and kind of hacking objects and things like that, I think that coming together with the sort of digital theatre, video mapping, sort of digital sonography, kind of experiential work like Punch Drunk, and people like that, you know. I think like those sorts of visceral kind of experiential kind of things, I think there's so much potential, and so for me, I think like I'd like to see work that's sort of dealing with real kind of issues, and you know, I don't think all work has to be political, but I do personally feel kind of like we live in a very kind of wealthy, kind of privileged kind of part of the world where we have technology and we can use it, and if we're just sitting there looking at fucking cats and like, you know, laughing at just bollocks, you know, it's just it depresses me personally as someone who's got 2 little girls who wants to see them, you know, have a future. I want people to make work that makes people think and makes people change the way they act. So that's just me, but I think there's also relevant to have work that doesn't do that maybe just really explores this space between film and image, you know. I think that's one of the things that got me interested in making this work, was when, you know, I think it started off with just turning the sound off on the television and playing like mixtapes when I was a kid. But you know, the gap between what you see and what you hear, and that kind of poetry that can enter, and the kind of the projection and the kind of interpretation that's there for the audience, I think is such a rich and beautiful place. So that's what all I've got to say on it. But and maybe Lisa, if you want to add anything to possibilities for new work, have you got anything? Because the people who are in the audience hopefully are kind of practitioners.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on it then. There is basically any money that we apply for from the BFI or the Arts Council, they love it when you say we have digital interventions. And Creative Europe as well, like we have Creative Europe funding that's going to run out soon because Brexit.
Cheers for that, yeah.
Yeah, in the application it says it must have digital, it must be digital. So anything that, even if you're a VR skeptic, I think you should really consider what VR could do for your work, and also how I'm really interested in domes and 360-degree projections. So if you work in that area, there's a new interest in that and in planetarium usage for your work, because of how we can map things made for headsets into a collective audience experience. So getting out of the headset is really important for the film exhibition sector, because there is people that are worried that, oh no, everyone's going to just be watching films on headsets at home on their own. So we're trying to find creative solutions to that, and liveness is the way to retain great cinema and great artwork in an age of video on demand, Netflix, when you can just sit at home and it's increasingly personalised. So think about the collective audience and how digital can help you do that.
That's good. Sally, do you want to add anything in terms of what possibilities do you maybe you can talk about it within your own work or other people's work, or things that you think?
Well, you know, I mean, for me, the possibilities have been from community and, in that sense, collectivity through their presentation of events. So, I mean, I like to program events. You know, half the time you think programming is a thankless task. It's it's an unpaid task. It's a lot of money a lot of the time.
Definitely.
A lot of the time. But, you know, the outcome is that you can give platforms to artists whose work is incredible, who you want to see yourself, and you want to see by situating their work amongst other practitioners. So I'm kind of interested in diversifying live cinema. I mean, I'm interested in seeing it against a sound art practice, a hybrid practice, a visual art practice, a new technology practice. But I'm also interested in coming away from these big systems, coming away from, sure, we all want funding, but these systems of manufacture where we have to come to a 360 dome. I mean, I love that stuff. I love the history of happenings, and I love the outcome and the result of this kind of big stage show. But what about when we come back to our own practices, which are almost more craft-led? I think there's a lot of value in actually thinking again about individual idiosyncrasies and our intuitive physical response to media. I don't always think it's about a big event. It can be very public facing and invite and involve people, but I think there's also the artist practitioner should be considered somewhat more too than the available technologies, and always adhering to these systems. just some thoughts, I guess.
Toby.
Hello. Yeah, well, I have two answers. So my commercial future, let alone my artistic future, is very much about this idea of how can we engage audiences and how can we marry kind of bespoke technology with people who can really conceive of interesting events and interesting concepts, and so we really can kind of deliver on that in elegant ways. That's what I'm personally going to be doing. But a more general answer is that throughout my whole kind of time doing live cinema, VJ and whatever, there just never has been scratch work or scratch spaces. Like to actually set up a kind of an expanded cinema environment. You know, you kind of need a warehouse, and then you need projectors, and like you're going to spend a day rigging it, and then where'd you get that all from? And then the few times we have as Defuse, we've managed to kind of pull this together where, like I basically nabbed a space at university and we're going to set it up and whatever. We only end up with like half an hour of actual experimentation just because there's so much overhead in kind of doing it. And that really was such a
really
bag.
good point.
So yeah, there's a kind of infrastructure thing there, but there's also just a kind of how can we experiment? How can we make small bits of work to fail quickly, right? Instead of, I think, Defuse and probably the Light Surgeons were kind of locked into like mega ambitious pieces, which means we mostly never make them.
They tend to. I mean, our projects tended to take about a year to a year and a half to make, but that's not unusual for a film. So, but I do agree. I think that's been one of my massive frustrations with the work, is like spending a lot of time not actually in a room. And that's why I love Sally's work and people that are more kind of doing direct sort of, it's a kind of this a kind of improvisation. Blanco is one of the other artists who's working. She runs a lot of projects working with sound artists and improvisers. And I think, yeah, the kind of that aspect of, yeah, like you were saying earlier, being able to just turn up with nothing and actually make something is really interesting. But I think, yeah, sandboxing and kind of testing things out and being able to find spaces where we can try this stuff out and see what works and what doesn't work, I think is a really good suggestion. And I think when we first started about Live Cinema Foundation as an idea was to try and do that, was to try and create a space in London, because we're all travelling around doing these festivals, but not really kind of finding a space in London to do it, And so John Luca, who's also in the audience, who runs LPM in Rome, which is an amazing festival, and he's behind this AV Node network. I think that's an interesting link to kind of what the festival's about, which is supporting other European countries that are doing this sort of work and sharing knowledge and sharing kind of how to put on events and kind of access to equipment. I think the answer maybe could be in things like Kit Split. I don't know if anyone heard of that, but that's an interesting concept, a bit like Airbnb for equipment, and sort of forming things online like that, where if you've got a projector, and you can loan it or hire it for cheap, I think the thing is that the answers are in everyone's hands. All these things can be done. I think the problem in London is just the cost of space, and maybe that will change with Brexit. Who knows? Hopefully, all the city people will leave and go to France or to Frankfurt with their glass towers and let the city go back to what it was. No, I think we're probably gonna have to finish. But did we have one last question? What opportunities are there for audiovisual performance outside of Splice Festival? Well, I made a reference there to AV Node. Please check out their website. Look at all of the other festivals. It's a pan-European project. We are still part of Europe at the moment, not for long. But hopefully, will we be able to be part of it after we've left? Are you going to kick us out? I mean, what's going to happen?
I don't think so. There are many. It's different from
some people aren't from the EU Union, are they? That are part of the festival.
Yeah, but there are also it's different, the European Community and the culture program. So the culture program is open also to countries that are out of the EU. So I think that UK will be in also after,
they're all right.
as Switzerland, for example.
Okay, so we can be like the Swiss. Okay. We're not paying anything.
Sorry. Could I give you a little celluloid offering? So apart from if you're interested in experimental film and using artist-run film labs, you could also look into filmlabs.org. So there is quite a large number of artist-run film labs, such as Labo Berlin, in Berlin, and Filmwerkplatz in Rotterdam. Oh, sorry, in Rotterdam. So the filmlab.org is a really interesting way into using a range of other technologies. Not to say that they don't collaborate with a range of hybrid artists as well. So.
And your event as well, your Unconscious Archives. When's the next one of those?
Oh, God, that's going to be a festival event in September. So if anyone is interested in finding out more about expanded cinema performance and artists working in a very live kind of way with sound up, please just check out the website of Unconscious Archives. You can join the email list and then you can come to the festival, because I'm particularly excited about working with those artists and rethinking technologies as well then.
And there's another event called VJ London, which if you're interested in the sort of kind of audio-visual VJing kind of work like that, you should check that out. They do like a monthly series of events. What else, Lisa, have you got anything to add? Like you mentioned Sheffield, which is an amazing festival.
Submit to film festivals, because like things like DocFest, Sheffield DocFest, there's like, I know I keep plugging it, but
they've never had me though. I've tried so hard to get into. I mean, I have.
Well,
I've
I think
shown films,
things might
but
change now. Where
is Hussein there?
No, he left
okay.
4 years
Maybe I have
ago.
a chance now.
So there's a marketplace for the alternate realities section, which is anything that's VR or installation-y, and the only real definition of what can go in there is that it's vaguely documentary, so it's inspired by real life. So please look at different film festivals, because nearly every film festival has, for want of a better word, an artist moving image strand, and they all know that live performances get audiences in. Leeds, Glasgow, Edinburgh, London, look at those film festivals and start conversations with them. And DocFest as well, there's so many open calls. I mean, it's a bit late now because it's starting in 2 weeks, but for next year. And also we'll make sure that Splice send out the news about when we're launching the live cinema talent pool and how that's going to work, because we'd love you all to apply, and we're going to help place new artworks within different contexts and get new audiences for awesome live cinema.
That sounds very good. I'm glad that's happening. So I think we'll wrap up there. Unless anyone wants to add anything, please put your hand up. Does anyone have anything to add or want to ask another question? Or anyone? Bueller? Sean. Sean ran. Okay, so Sean was. Oh, what's that? Manchester does have a good, test card. So Sean ran an event earlier that was a kind of I mean, what came out of your conversation earlier, man? Is there anything you want
to? There was lots of things, but in terms of like, Sally, I was trying to get Sally to come up as part of a project that I was trying to get funding for, but it fell through. And it keeps like, I don't want to rely on funding. That's like, I want to build a business model that supports this kind of thing, which is more, that doesn't rely on people giving me money. I want to make it in terms of like, I'm trying to build closer relationships with the Manchester universities around me. So build it into a module into their course. So try and develop talent, and then also represent them when they go out into like the world, and try and like as an agent almost as well. So like, because the thing about what I do with Test Card is that people are coming to me asking for artists to come and do stuff at their places and stuff as well. So I'm just trying to think of a business model that I can build, which doesn't revolve around funding, because that's all I ever hear is about funding.
Yeah, I think you're quite right, Sean, because I love the idea of education and community. I'm, as a practitioner, I'm really sick myself of everything being like about the big top game, and I don't think we should be controlled by the funding bodies in that sense. But the education idea is has been, so prevalent, such as the artist Tony Conrad, who I mentioned before, working within these education models to produce and present and talk about work. We forget about these contexts.
Definitely, yeah. There's some great workshops happening this year. If you have ideas for workshops that you'd like to see here at the festival, please let us know, because I think we want to really make that a big part of this festival. Okay, if anyone's got anything else, I think we'll probably stop here.